Things are getting very interesting around the Baltimore Ravens, and we need to talk about something that has a lot of fans looking back and asking some uncomfortable questions. We all know how important Lamar Jackson has been to this franchise, and man, the Ravens cannot afford to waste the opportunity they have with number 8. I really want to see Lamar bring another Super Bowl to Baltimore. That is the dream, and why not this year? But after seeing what happened with Daniel Falale and John Harbaugh, a lot of fans are wondering if Lamar was asked to carry too much for too long. Falale started in front of Lamar for 2 years, but after just one preseason game protecting Jackson Dart, Harbaugh was apparently ready to move on from him. So I want to know which side you're on. Do you believe Harbaugh relied too much on Lamar Jackson to cover the problems around this team? Or do you think the criticism of his time in Baltimore has gone too far? Write your opinion in the comments. And if you've been a Baltimore Ravens fan for more than 15 years, hit that like button hard. Alright, let's talk about John Harbaugh, Lamar Jackson, and why this Daniel Falale situation has Ravens fans asking what could have been. Because this story is really not just about Daniel Falale. That is what makes it so interesting. It is about a much bigger criticism of the way John Harbaugh coached the Baltimore Ravens during the Lamar Jackson era. And it raises a question that is probably going to bother Ravens fans for a very long time. How much better could this team have been? The argument made in the discussion was simple. John Harbaugh had Lamar Jackson, one of the most talented quarterbacks in football. And because Lamar could cover up so many problems, Baltimore sometimes appeared willing to live with issues that should have been addressed much sooner. Think about how this entire story started. Harbaugh was 4-5 when Joe Flacco went down. Lamar stepped in, Baltimore started winning, and the direction of the franchise changed. From that point forward, Lamar became the player capable of rescuing situations that might have been much more difficult with another quarterback. And that is exactly why the Daniel Falale example has become so frustrating. Falale started in front of Lamar Jackson for 2 seasons. Whatever people thought about his performance, Baltimore continued putting him on the field as one of the players responsible for protecting number 8. Then Harbaugh goes to New York. Falale is not even entering the situation as the established Giants starter. He is a backup offensive lineman. He plays one preseason game in front of Jackson Dart, and suddenly the conversation changes. He becomes tradable. The possibility of moving on becomes acceptable. That is where Ravens fans are asking the obvious question. Why now? Why was that standard apparently acceptable when Lamar Jackson was behind him, but suddenly unacceptable when another quarterback needed protection? That does not automatically answer every question about Harbaugh's years in Baltimore, but it absolutely explains why this situation has touched a nerve with the fan base. The criticism presented in the discussion is that Harbaugh relied too much on Lamar to save the day. If something was not perfect around Lamar, number 8 could fix it. If protection broke down, Lamar could escape. If a play fell apart, Lamar could create something. If Baltimore needed something special, Lamar could provide it. But the problem with having a quarterback capable of doing extraordinary things is that his greatness can make everybody else's weaknesses easier to tolerate. And eventually, that can become dangerous. Instead of asking how good the team could become if every detail around Lamar was handled properly, the organization could simply trust Lamar to overcome those details.
That is why the question raised by Rob Long hit so hard. How much better could Baltimore have been? Ravens fans have watched seasons where this team looked capable of reaching the Super Bowl. They have watched Lamar have tremendous individual success. They have watched Baltimore build teams talented enough to create enormous expectations. But they are still waiting for the first Super Bowl of the Lamar Jackson era. And according to this criticism, that is what makes looking backwards so painful. What if Baltimore had approached every weakness with the urgency we are apparently seeing from Harbaugh now? What if the Ravens had looked at protection and said being good enough was not enough? What if they had been less comfortable relying on Lamar's ability to make difficult situations work? Nobody can go backward and change those seasons. Nobody can guarantee Baltimore would have won a Super Bowl. But Ravens fans can absolutely wonder whether some opportunities were left on the table. And Falale is not the only offensive lineman mentioned in this conversation. Andrew Voorhees was another example. Voorhees struggled, yet he remained a starter throughout last season. Baltimore had other players on the roster, but those alternatives were not given a meaningful opportunity according to the discussion. Then Jesse Minter takes over, and suddenly everything feels different. There was almost nothing being heard about Voorhees as a starting option. Baltimore then signed John Simpson, and the direction became pretty clear. Voorhees was no longer viewed the same way. Again, look at the pattern Ravens fans are seeing. A player can remain in the lineup while Lamar is expected to make everything work. Then circumstances change, and suddenly there is much less patience. That is why some fans are looking at this new era and feeling both excitement and frustration at the same time. The excitement comes from Jesse Minter. The frustration comes from wondering why these changes could not have happened sooner. Baltimore made the major decision this offseason to move on from John Harbaugh and bring in Minter. And one of the early differences mentioned by Ravens players has been Minter's attention to detail. Rashad Bateman, Ronnie Stanley, and Marlon Humphrey were mentioned in connection with that idea. The message coming through is that Minter pays attention to the little things. That sounds simple, but little things become very big things in the NFL. One missed assignment can destroy a drive. One protection mistake can put your quarterback in danger. One defensive mistake can turn into a touchdown. One decision that gets delayed for weeks can become the difference between fixing a weakness and carrying that weakness into the biggest games of the season. So when Ravens players are already noticing attention to detail, fans are naturally going to compare it with what they experienced before. That does not erase what Harbaugh accomplished in Baltimore. The discussion is focused on something much more specific, whether the later years became too comfortable because Lamar Jackson was so good. And that question extends beyond the offensive line. Wide receiver was another major source of frustration. For years, Baltimore's approach at receiver left fans wanting more. During Harbaugh's tenure, that frustration became especially strong because Lamar was developing into an elite quarterback while the Ravens repeatedly relied on receivers who came with major questions. Dez Bryant created excitement even though he had been away from the game for years. Sammy Watkins could play when healthy, but his injury history was already well known, and injuries remained part of the story. Deshaun Jackson arrived after being away from regular action. Odell Beckham Jr. brought a great presence to Baltimore, but he was returning after a long absence and was not the same player he had been earlier in his career. DeAndre Hopkins was different in the sense that he was not expected to arrive as the number one receiver. His role was supposed to complement Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman. The larger point is not that wide receiver was the only reason Baltimore did not win a championship. It clearly was not. The point is that when you have Lamar Jackson, why wouldn't you do everything possible to surround him with the strongest situation available? That is the question connecting all of this. Protection. Receivers. Personnel decisions. Coaching details. How much did Baltimore ask Lamar to overcome? And how many problems were allowed to stay problems because the Ravens knew Lamar could make something happen anyway? There is another uncomfortable part of this conversation.